Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. Our guest today is Mohamed ElBaradei. He was the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, from 1997 until 2009. And as such, he was a central player in the lead up to the war in Iraq exactly 20 years ago. He joins us from Vienna. Thank you very much, Mr. ElBaradei.
Thank you for having me, Peter.
So I want to rewind 20 years ago, early 2003. In late January, you tell the United Nations Security Council that the agency found no evidence that Saddam Hussein had revived its nuclear weapons program. A week later, U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell gave his infamous speech in front of the Security Council, arguing that Saddam had in fact, again, been pursuing weapons of mass destruction. On March the 7th, you go back before the council, you tell them that your inspectors on the ground are making progress, and part of the intelligence the US and Britain are offering to support their claim is actually based on forged document. And the very next day, President George W. Bush delivers a radio address. He says the inspections team did not need any more time because Saddam was still refusing to disarm. And on March 19th, the US and the UK invaded Iraq. I just wanted to set the stage. Did you know at that time, early on, that there was no other issue than the war?
I believe so, Mark. This was a very difficult time. It was a difficult time for the world. It was a difficult time for the Americans. It was a difficult time for the international organizations. The war is, if I now look in hindsight, it was not really about weapons of mass destruction. It was about regime change. That was becoming now very, very clear. The US at that time went through a very tragic terrorist attack. They were the only kid in the block after the end of the Soviet Union, and they decided that they wanted, to spread democracy and change a regime that is not really espousing the American values. They picked up Iraq. They thought the best pretext was to say that Saddam Hussein was linked to the Qaeda and he has weapons of mass destruction. The bad news that they tried to rely on international inspectors because they didn't really have any evidence, if you like. It was all about belief. And they started a slew of deception and misinformation. As we went to Iraq, we couldn't see anything. There was absolutely no whiff of weapons of mass or nuclear weapon revival. And we went into a war that should not have been. And now we realize that it's a war that had horrible human cost in terms of the Iraqis, horrible implication on the region in terms of terrorism, radicalism. So it was actually not about weapon of mass destruction. And as we went in the last 3 or 4 months we were there, we have become very, very clear, very, very clear that this was not about weapon of mass destruction. It was about a war concocted by a group of extreme right neocons at the US at that time. And if I tell you later on about France, France was on our side. France was very clear that there was no weapon of mass destruction. I had a meeting I remember this famous meeting with Jacques Chirac. When I went with Hans Blix, my colleague, we were complaining to him that we do not have any evidence. Where is the beef? And I very much remember what Jacques Chirac told us. He said, you know why you don't have any evidence? Because they don't have them. And at that time, we were vindicated in our impression that this is not really about weapon of mass destruction, that there was no threat to the UK or to the US. It was just a pretext to get rid of Saddam Hussein, thinking that this was the beginning of an Arab Spring, a spread of democracy. Unfortunately, as we have now known, it took the region very much backward, and we're still suffering from the implications of that war. Saddam Hussein was a dictator, there's no question about it. But the question, do you go into a country, destroy a country, completely just to get rid of a dictator. This is a question we see in many countries, and it's a question we need to understand that this is not the way. Regime change, if it happens, has to come from within, has to come from within the country. You cannot impose a political system. You cannot impose democracy. It has to come from within. So we got very painful lessons from Iraq, and I hope that people understood that if you're dealing with a dictator, if you're dealing with repression, oppression, it's not the way that you go with force. I mean, also, one of the bad stuff from this war, that the American, it acted like a bull in a china shop. They completely disregarded international law. They completely disregarded the UN Charter. And I still very much remember, of course, Dominique de Villepin, famous speech at the Security Council, and the German and many others who realized that this is a crazy march, including even, unfortunately, Colin Powell, who I think was used, unfortunately, right, in having somebody with such a credibility come with such a statement and realize afterward that a lot of what he said was fake. I talked to at that day with Colin Powell, and he said, if I included everything that CIA and other intelligence agencies wanted me to say to the council, the statement, my statement, would be few hours, And he spent a week at Langley at CIA trying to sift through what the information he had. But unfortunately, again, they sold him stuff that's not accurate. I can, one example where I realized completely before the war that this was a total deceit was this idea that Iraq was buying uranium from Niger. It took us a few weeks to try to get these papers. My colleague at that time, a brilliant French scientist, Jacques Baud, was after all the intelligence agencies tried to get the document. Then we got the document, and it took him a couple of hours to realize that it's a complete forgery, a crude forgery. And of course, that at that point, I realized this is not serious. This is not really people who are concerned about weapons of mass destruction. These are people who want to use this as a pretext, as a facade.
Do they include George Bush? I mean, you talk about this group of neocons. There's a question of whether George W. Bush was taken hostage, if you may say, or you recount in your book meeting him? I mean, was he also clearly the decider in chief?
Well, I think it was, it was a group, of people, and that decision to go to war, as far as I understand, started with in 2011, immediately after the 9/11 attack, and it was Paul Wolfowitz, it was a group of people around Bush who told them the only way to show that we are, nobody can mess up with us is just to go after Iraq. And they tried to find an excuse. And again, they tried to find something they can agree on. And they finally agreed on weapons of mass destruction. This is, but it was not really serious. As I said, it was an ideological war based on lies and deceit, unfortunately. And what is really painful is that right now we see something like a million Iraqis, who lost their life. I mean, the last count I saw last week from Lancet, the medical journal, was 650,000. Right. But we never counted how many people died in Iraq. We know every single American soldier who died in Iraq, rightly so. But we never bothered to look at how many people died in Iraq.
So there's no accountability. Is that what you're saying?
There was zero accountability until today. I mean, in both the UK, we had the Shellcott report, which took like 6-7 years and said, yes, it was absolutely no good. not justified in terms of law, in terms of facts, but all what we did is basically Tony Blair essentially saying, oops, we made a mistake. In the US, the Senate made a long, again, investigation and concluded that we did it all, we were all wrong on our conclusion, but there was no accountability whatsoever. I haven't seen anybody held accountable, no criminal charges against anybody. More importantly, did we do anything to make sure that we do not repeat such a catastrophe, such a disaster? I don't think we did. And that is, again, that's an issue we need to revisit. People need to have accountability. When I hear now all the time about Ukraine, about the need to have an international criminal court, when I talk about people accountability for war crimes, I can't help ask myself, how about Iraq? You cannot just have double standard and then you are surprised that the global West think there is double standard. I saw a couple of weeks ago, I think President Macron saying he was surprised that the South think that there is double standard. Of course there is double standard, and that is the prevailing view, I can tell you. Everywhere I go to the global South, they feel that there is something good for the goose and something good for the ganders. And that is not an international system we can work with. It is doomed. This is not, if you want a functioning global order, Mark, you need to have a system based on equity and inclusiveness.
Mohamed ElBaradei, that's all we have time for. I want to thank you very much for appearing here on the France 24 interview from Vienna, and thank you all for watching it.